Well, good afternoon, colleagues. This is Amanda Bergson-Chilcock at the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians. Thank you for joining us on what is a very hot afternoon here in Philadelphia for this webinar. A couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. If you run into any issues or problems technically speaking on the webinar, please feel free to email my colleague Bao at bao@welcomingcenter.org at any point during the webinar. Again, that's bao@welcomingcenter.org. If you're the kind of person who likes to take notes, you'll be happy to know that you will be getting an email copy of today's slides following the webinar. So it's not necessary to try to take notes on everything we're going to be going through here today. You will get an email PDF version of the complete slideshow for today. A recording of today's webinar will also be available to you next week, so that will also be an option. We have a question and answer box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. If you have questions at any point during the webinar, please feel free to type your question there. We may take it as we're going through, or we may hold it till the Q&A period at the end of today's webinar. But don't be shy and do feel free to ask questions at any time. Again, this is Amanda Bergson-Chilcock, and today we're going to be talking about a study that the Welcoming Center recently released, findings from that study with regard to implications for regions outside of the Philadelphia area. Again, for those of you who've just joined us in the last minute, this is Amanda Bergson-Chilcock at the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians. We will be sending out slides from today's webinar, so you will get a PDF of today's slides, and there will also be a recording available next week. So just one more housekeeping detail before we get started. What I won't be doing today is going through in detail each of the specific findings from our report. It's a 45-page report. There's quite a lot of detail in there. Today's webinar is really focusing on the implications of our findings for other municipalities around the country. So it's not going to go into great level of depth about the Philadelphia-specific findings. We're happy to set up further conversations if you have questions or if you have follow-up inquiries after the webinar today. All right, so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Our webinar today is going to have four components. I'm going to talk very briefly just to set the stage about the context of immigrant talent attraction and retention initiatives nationwide. We're going to talk a little bit about Philadelphia's numbers, what the success has been in our region at attracting newcomers. We're going to talk a bit about the data, that is, how the data in the Choosing Philadelphia study was gathered and what we looked at, what questions we looked at. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about policy options, different strategies for municipalities that are seeking to grow their immigrant populations. We'll have a nice chunk of time for questions and answers. Again, you're welcome to ask a question at any point during the webinar by typing in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. If for some reason you're not able to do that, you can also send your question to bao@welcomingcenter.org. That's bao@welcomingcenter.org. And then at the very end of today's webinar, and this is an optional segment after the Q&A, we're going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of data collection. And that's particularly for those of you who might be interested in replicating this survey or something similar to it in your own municipality. But we're putting that at the tail end of today's webinar because we know that may not be of interest to everyone. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about the context. We have seen nationwide skyrocketing interest in immigrants as part of a broader economic and population growth strategy. In the past few years, several dozen cities and states have announced their own versions of immigrant talent attraction and retention initiatives, those have taken various forms. We've put on this chart here just a handful of the many such initiatives that have launched recently. And this is in no way meant to be comprehensive, but just meant to illustrate a little bit of the range of initiatives. You can see that some are city-focused, some are statewide, some are in the Midwest, some are in smaller cities, some are in larger cities. There's really quite a lot of variation. As of right now, the primary focus is cities in the upper Midwest, Midwestern areas of the country, and as well as the sort of formerly industrial areas of the Northeast and to some extent New England. That's not to say there aren't similar initiatives in other parts of the country, but that's certainly where the bulk of these are concentrated right now. And these initiatives really range in focus. Some are a one staff person project with a very modest budget. Others are a bit more ambitious, both financially and human resource-wise, and they offer a range of services. Some are primarily focused on welcoming and integration activities, such as town hall meetings, community dinners, dialogues. Others are focused specifically on populations such as refugee communities. Some are focused on building the capacity of existing immigrant service organizations and other nonprofits. Others are really focused on municipal policy and are perhaps even housed within cities, counties, or other governmental entities. So we're not going to go in depth into these initiatives, but I just wanted to set the stage in terms of talking about the range that we're seeing nationwide. And as mentioned, the impetus for a lot of these is demographic change, an aging population with more people retiring and moving out of the workforce, a shrinking tax base, and in many cases, the challenge of a substantial number of vacant lots and or vacant storefronts. And that's something we're going to talk about a bit later on when we talk about entrepreneurship-focused activities. So that's a little bit of the national context. Now I wanted to give a little background on Philadelphia and the particular growth of immigrant populations in this region in the last 20, but particularly the last 10 years, and document that with a little bit of factual information so that you have that context as well. Philadelphia is what's known as a re-emerging gateway. That is, we're not a city like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York that has seen a steady flow of immigrants for the last 100 years. Rather, we saw a peak at the beginning of the 20th century and then dipped much lower in the midpoint of the 20th century in the 1950s and 60s. And then towards the end of the 20th century in the 1980s and 90s began to see the pickup begin again. Today, there's about 175,000 immigrants in the city of Philadelphia, about 500,000 in the larger metro region. Within the city of Philadelphia, there's quite a lot of diversity in the immigrant population. You can see this pie chart here illustrating the major regions of origin for immigrants from around the world. And the city's population is pretty close to the national proportion of immigrants, 12% in the city, 13% nationwide. The region is a little bit lower. It's about 9%. And there's quite a bit of diversity in different areas of the Philadelphia region, which is actually an 11-county area, according to census designation. This chart lets you see the distinction between the diversity of Philadelphia immigrants versus nationwide. So the solid color blocks are the national figures. The checkers are Philadelphia region. And in particular, I would draw your attention to the fact that we have double the proportion of African immigrants as you see nationwide. 1 in 10, it's actually closer to 10% than 9% now. 1 in 10 immigrants in Philadelphia are from Africa, compared to about 4% nationwide. And a much smaller percentage of immigrants here in Philadelphia are from Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the reasons this matters is because it means that the immigrant population here is also very linguistically diverse. In contrast to parts of the country where most of the immigrants are coming from the Spanish-speaking world, the immigrant communities here really are, the top languages spoken include Russian, Korean, Vietnamese, as well as Spanish, French among many of the African immigrants, although some are English-speaking, and quite a variety of other languages. So that does have some implications for public policy decisions and for outreach efforts. Educationally, Philadelphia immigrants are somewhat typical of immigration patterns in that they're both more likely than native-born residents to have a college or graduate degree, but also more likely to have very limited education, less than a high school degree, and in some cases less than an 8th grade education. And so I included this slide in part because different communities around the country are really in different places when it comes to this question. Pittsburgh has a particularly high proportion of immigrants with college degrees. Other cities and towns have much smaller proportions of highly educated new arrivals and have a higher proportion of those with less education. And so it's a particularly important variable on many of the other metrics we're going to be looking at today, and so I wanted to include this slide here as part of the context of the region. So how did Philadelphia get to having this relatively robust immigrant population? Back in November 2007, when Mayor Michael Nutter was elected to his first term, he pledged to increase the city's population. And this was particularly notable because the city had been losing population for more than half a century. Like many larger and industrial cities across the Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia had been shrinking. And so when Mayor Nutter proposed this was 75,000 net new residents. So understanding that there would be natural population loss through death and through people moving away, he wanted to not only attract enough residents to replace those lost through natural population loss, but also increase the size of the city. And you can see from this headline here, this is a independent publication here in Philadelphia focused on the public schools. Their headline was, "A Plan in the Works to Make Philly Immigrant Friendly." Now, this wasn't original to Mayor Nutter. We had a city council person, Councilman Kenny, who had proposed an Office of New Philadelphians in May of 2001. City council had gone on summer hiatus, and over the summer, of course, as they returned from hiatus, September 11th happened. And so the concept of making the city more welcoming to immigrants sort of fell off the radar screen. And when Mayor Nutter was elected and made this population pledge, it was clear that immigrants would be a part of trying to increase the city's population. As of the July 2013 census figures, the mayor's goal has not only been met, but has been exceeded with 105,000 net new residents since he set his goal approximately 6 years ago. And immigrants are indeed a big part of what is causing that growth. We included a couple of newspaper headlines here, as well as a note from the Brookings Institution that illustrates that it's not just that Philadelphia's population is growing again, but that it's growing again in large measure because of immigrants. So that's the context. And you'll see that that's not just growth that was happening in the city, that's the chart on the left there with the sort of bluish-green line, but also growth that was happening in the metro area. And both of these charts show growth that was flat or declining in the 1970s and 80s and then began to pick up after 1990. So that tells you a bit about the fact that our region grew and that it grew because of immigrants. It doesn't really tell you why immigrants chose our region. And while the Welcoming Center has been in business for 11 years, and we have provided a wide range of employment, educational, and entrepreneurship services during that time, we had not previously documented on this scale what actually brought newcomers to the region. So the impetus for our study was to ask people what caused them to select our region and what caused them to stay. And you can see on this slide the report cover. The full 44-page report is available on our website, and you can see the URL just below the report cover on this slide here. We've also released publicly the survey instrument, the 3-page survey that we use to gather this data. And we'll be talking about that a bit more at the end of today's webinar with regard to how you might use or adapt that in your community if you're interested in doing a similar survey. Our survey spoke to 364 people. We did approximately 100 in-person interviews in English, approximately 100 in-person in Spanish, and then another 165 or so online surveys, and those were all done in English. We spoke to immigrants from 74 countries, and we did make the deliberate choice to include Puerto Ricans in our survey. Puerto Ricans, of course, are not immigrants. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, and Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens by birth. However, in the Philadelphia region, the Puerto Rican population is a significant chunk of the Hispanic community and a significant chunk of the limited English proficient community. And for that reason, we chose to include Puerto Ricans in our survey. There are a lot of aspects of moving from the island of Puerto Rico to the mainland United States that are similar to immigration in terms of the bilingual and bicultural issues that people encounter. I mention that because most of the other immigrant talent attraction and retention initiatives nationwide are not going on in communities that have a substantial Puerto Rican population. In fact, most of them don't. And so that's just an important note about our survey. We did not see enormously significant differences between Puerto Rican respondents and other survey respondents, but I just wanted to call out the fact that we included people. And while we did not have the budget to make this survey fully statistically representative, we did put enormous effort into making it as wide-ranging as possible in terms of speaking with people of different ages and genders and class backgrounds and geographic locations and professional levels and employment statuses and in every other way. We have a 3-page methodology section in our report, so if you're curious about the nitty-gritty of who we talked to and how we selected them, you're more than welcome to explore that further. And then I wanted to talk briefly about what we covered in our survey. So, of course, we did ask the reasons that had prompted the person to move to the Philadelphia region in the first place. We asked how people had gathered information about the region before they arrived here. We asked people about their sense of welcome, both the sense of welcome that they had from the region overall and the sense of welcome that they had in specific settings. In particular, we asked about workplace, we asked about faith or places of worship, we asked about schools, if the respondents had children. We asked about the sense of welcome in libraries and with interactions with the police, as well as a couple of other factors. We asked the likelihood of respondents, the likelihood that respondents would recommend our area to others, and we're going to talk quite a bit about word of mouth later on. And then finally, we asked about respondents' long-term plans. Do you plan that in the next 5 to 10 years you'll be staying in the Philadelphia region or leaving? Now, you'll hear me talk a lot about the city and the region in today's discussion. Our survey included a large number of people from the city of Philadelphia and a very large number of people from the suburbs of Philadelphia. We did a lot of cross-tabulation to detect whether there were appreciable differences between city and suburban respondents, and by and large, there were not. And I just want to emphasize that because people often assume that people living in a city might have a very different perspective from suburban respondents. We did not see that. And there's a couple of hypotheses we have about that, but I just wanted to mention that. And, of course, the overall findings that we had, not just the specific answers that people gave to individual questions, but the overall analysis that we did really reflected the fact that steps that have been taken by both municipal authorities and civic and nonprofit organizations have helped to make the region a more welcoming and what I call a more sticky place. That is, that people don't just come here to go to college or pass through here, but they actually choose to make it their permanent home. So we're now going to spend the next chunk of time in the webinar talking about the implications of these findings for other municipalities. I'm going to pause just briefly in case there are any questions about what we've worked through so far before I turn to that next phase here. As a reminder, if you have a question, we're asking you to type in the lower right-hand corner of your screen into the Q&A box, or if for any reason you're having difficulties with that, you can email your question to bao@welcomingcenter.org. That's BAO @welcomingcenter.org. Okay, so I think that we'll move now to the policy options section. So I want to be clear about a couple of things here. One is these are a few potential strategies that stem from our findings. You may have other ideas as you look at these findings, and we have also highlighted some, but by no means all, of the steps that Philadelphia has taken with respect to most of these findings. There are a couple of areas where we didn't go in depth into what Philadelphia has done. And I emphasize that because this is really something that I encourage you to think of as a menu of options rather than the be-all and end-all list of all possible policies or all possible steps that Philadelphia has taken. So our first finding really emphasized the importance of extended social and personal ties in attracting and retaining newcomers. A number of survey respondents talked to us about the fact that it wasn't just that they had a husband or a wife or a sibling who helped them get oriented in Philadelphia. It's that they had a friend from their home village or an acquaintance who helped them get their first job or helped them by allowing them to room with them in their apartment for the first month. So that's an overwhelming finding that we heard across a lot of respondents. And so that suggests to us that there are a number of different strategies that municipalities may want to do to try to foster word of mouth among current residents to encourage additional residents to join their communities. So obviously that can include a specific public relations effort or messaging that encourages current residents to share their happiness or satisfaction with the municipality with other friends. Ensuring that existing small faith organizations, ethnic groups, and others are aware of municipal programs. It's often the case that we talk to municipalities who feel that because they're broadcasting a lot of their resources, that broadcast must be being received. But in fact, we often find that there is a whole world going on that is not necessarily on an email mailing list for the city government or seeing an announcement that is coming out through the city's listserv. And so making sure that there are proactive steps to inform those organizations of municipal programs that are of interest to newcomers is really important. Profiling success stories of newcomers. In some communities, this has been done through the press with newspaper articles. In other cases, it's done through newsletters, through blogs and websites, through video storytelling. There are a range of ways to do it, but the meta message that is being sent with each individual profile is, I succeeded here and you can too. And then finally, given the importance of peer referrals in endorsing new locations in the U.S., we do encourage municipalities to think about working on college campuses. College students are often in contact with peers at other universities in other cities and could be encouraged to share with their fellow graduates as they are graduating from school and looking for employment, their sense of welcome and their sense of satisfaction in their current municipality. So, a couple of quick examples of how Philadelphia has tackled some of these. Our Mayor's Office of Immigrant and Multicultural Affairs was established relatively recently. It was launched early in 2013, but it builds on a longer process of less formalized work that had been done through the Mayor's Office. And today is holding a Cross-Cultural Passport Week, which is done during National Welcoming Week in September, and spotlights community organizations and events in its email newsletter. The Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition works with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to do nonpartisan voter registration at every naturalization ceremony in our region. What that means is, over the last 6 years, they've built a database of more than 20,000 newly naturalized immigrants who live in our region because they naturalized here, and could be people who could serve as ambassadors or contacts, or can simply be people to help get the word out about initiatives and activities. And then again, our organization, the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians, also publishes a newsletter that reaches about 9,000 contacts with all kinds of practical information, news updates, policy backgrounders, and other resources. So those are just a few examples of trying to foster more of that positive word of mouth so that immigrants who are already present here are talking up the city and the region to their social networks who are beyond Philadelphia. So our next finding is really pretty straightforward in that momentum really does breed momentum. That is, people arrive here, they find that there's already a community of others who share their language, who share their religion, who come from their country, and that helps them to feel at home and feel welcome. But I want to sort of add a very important caveat to that, because I know that can seem discouraging for communities that have relatively small immigrant populations overall. And that is that we overwhelmingly heard from people in our survey that they were not comparing Philadelphia to New York or Boston or Chicago or other cities that Philadelphians often think we might want to compare ourselves to. Rather, they were comparing Philadelphia to other cities or states that they'd heard about in the United States. So we had comments about, well, this compared to Virginia, that compared to Minnesota. And so it really brought home to us that the peer communities with which we're competing for immigrants are not necessarily the ones that Philadelphians think are competitor communities, but the ones in which are on the sort of mental Rolodex of immigrants who are considering which community they may settle in. And if you're interested in this topic, I'd encourage you to, again, look closely at our full-length report on our website at welcomingcenter.org/choosephl. That longer report does have quite a bit more detail on this particular topic. So given that diversity is relative, and given that municipalities that may have relatively low numbers of immigrants overall could still be showcasing their diversity, how could that happen? Well, the first thing is to really talk to current residents about what they believe are the assets that the city or the municipality possesses with regard to diversity. Philadelphia has been a place of religious tolerance for a very long time. We had one of the first mosques in North America, and the fact that we have a significant Muslim community, the fact that we have supermarkets where if you walk in right now, it's during Ramadan, and there is a display of dates right as you walk in the door, because people who are hosting iftars and breaking their Ramadan fasts want to be able to purchase dates. It's a key food for that celebration. Those are culturally sensitive touches that may or may not be sort of on the radar screen of people who are part of the majority population or American-born community members, but could be very significant to new arrivals. And then they're often informal, what you might call communities of interest, or what in other contexts are similar to NORCs. NORCs are naturally occurring retirement communities, that is, places where elders have congregated to live, even if it's not traditionally an over 55 community. And the same thing happens in immigrant communities. And then finally, I want to talk about signal boosting. So signal boosting is a term that's often used. It sort of comes from radio and the concept that somebody, a interesting or creative young person might have started a new initiative, the Haitian Professionals of Philadelphia, or a similar project. And that initiative might not have gotten the publicity that it could have gotten if your organization or your municipality uses a larger megaphone to spread the word. So rather than trying to start new initiatives from scratch, making sure that you're aware of existing initiatives or existing naturally occurring communities of interest, and then signal boosting to get the word out about those communities. And again, I just want to emphasize, that organic initiatives often spring from enlightened self-interest. That is, people aren't necessarily saying, well, how can we attract more immigrants to the region? They're saying, well, how do I get enough members in my Chamber of Commerce? How do I make sure that my student organization survives and can make a transition to another student leader after I graduate? And so here in Philadelphia, there are organizations like the Philadelphia Folklore Project that has a mission of supporting traditional arts and culture, but has a result of fostering community roots in, for example, the West African community. So the Folklore Project's mission is focused around arts and culture, but because they make small grants to organizations you see pictured on this slide here, the Liberian Women's Chorus for Change, because the Folklore Project helps to be the intermediary between these small immigrant and ethnic community groups and larger entities like statewide arts and culture organizations that provide grants for artists. Those entities, those folklore projects and mural arts programs, in the process of carrying out their actual missions as organizations, have the happy side effect of fostering more diverse and more welcoming communities. So I think that's the sort of emphasis I wanted to put on Philadelphia's piece here. I want to talk a little bit also about the blend of primary and secondary arrivals. So a primary migrant is somebody who settles in your community as their first U.S. destination. And for the purposes of the study that the Welcoming Center did, we defined that first destination as where you came within the first week of arriving in the United States. So if you flew into New York City but then immediately took a bus to Philadelphia, we counted Philadelphia as your first destination. If you spent a month living in New York and decided it was too expensive and came to Philadelphia, we counted Philadelphia as your second destination. So I really wanted to emphasize this finding because I think it's very easy for immigrant talent attraction and retention initiatives to focus on one or the other of these demographic groups rather than both. And indeed, the strategies and the tactics might need to be different. You're using a different approach when you're trying to reach people who are still living abroad versus people who are already living in the U.S. and might be convinced to pick up and move elsewhere. So I just wanted to emphasize the need to sort of do it's a both and, not an either or. And there are a variety of ways that you can gather information about existing differences in migration streams in your community and then work on ways to improve or increase either or both of them. The census has a lot of the American Community Survey, which is publicly available data on census.gov, has a lot of information if you search under residents by 1 year ago. That is, they ask people, were you living in the same house 1 year ago? Were you living in a different house in the same county? Were you living in a different county? Were you living in a different state? Or were you living outside the United States? And so that data is a really helpful way to get a snapshot of where newcomers in your community are coming from, and particularly where foreign-born newcomers in your community are coming from. Spot surveys, which are not as elaborate as the study I'm describing today, can also be really helpful. And then, of course, refugee resettlement organizations are the ones who have their ear to the ground with regard to what we call guided migration. That is, refugees, because they are the only immigrants who arrive in the U.S. and are oftentimes literally met at the airport by resettlement agencies and help to be settled in their first apartments or first homes. Communities often have both the most data and the most knowledge about these new arrivals. So while refugees may be small in overall numbers, and they represent just 6% of all immigrants nationwide, they can be significant with regard to a community's ability to predict who is going to be moving and joining their communities. So I want to talk a bit about another finding as well, and that is that tangible outcomes were often the most salient feature. And what I mean by that is when we asked people what made them feel welcome in Philadelphia, instead of saying, I felt welcome or I didn't feel welcome, people often answered the question by telling us how long it had taken them to get a job. And people who found that they'd been able to find work reported then that they felt welcome. So being able to find your economic footing is really a decisive factor in whether you feel at home in the region. And it does seem to flow in that direction. That is, the outcomes predict your feeling of welcome rather than the other way around. So there are a variety of ways that immigrant talent attraction and retention initiatives can help connect newcomers to employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. And many of the specific initiatives that I mentioned on the earlier part of today's webinar are already doing a number of activities, but I wanted to lift up a couple of activities that I think have been particularly effective in different communities nationwide, not just in Philadelphia. Offering meaningful internship and placement opportunities through employer partners. Those of you who are on the Imprint mailing list probably saw the recent announcement from Imprint about their new expansion of their Global Engineers in Residence program in Michigan. That's a terrific example of an employer-driven program that helps immigrant engineers to find their first professional job in the U.S. And then ensuring that there's a strong connection between existing workforce and small business programs and immigrant communities. And there's a variety of ways to do this. In some cases, it's really just about making sure that referrals are happening. In other cases, it's about actually subcontracting with an immigrant organization to provide those employment or small business services. So here in Philadelphia, our local Workforce Investment Board does indeed subcontract with the Welcoming Center and with other organizations to help ensure that work-authorized immigrants and limited English-speaking Philadelphians can find employment. We've also published a series of career guides that help provide guidance on the re-credentialing process for immigrant professionals. So those are just a couple of the examples of how we foster employment. Around entrepreneurship, the city's Commerce Department contracts with the Welcoming Center to provide culturally competent small business services, and the Department of Licenses and Inspections and the Health Department, both of which work with, for example, immigrant-owned food trucks, immigrant-owned restaurants, and other immigrant-owned businesses, regularly meet with community representatives to talk about issues of concern for immigrant merchants. And that's everything from zoning questions for people who are coming from countries where zoning is not familiar or not used, questions around enforcement issues. So, the Chinese Restaurant Association head will say, a number of restaurants have been cited for improper disposal of cooking oil. How can we, problem solve this? What are some potential solutions? And then the How to Start a Business guides, many of which you see pictured on the slide here, as well as English for Entrepreneurs classes and opportunity calls, are really ways to, again, be that intermediary, be that bridge between existing municipal services for small business owners and immigrant service organizations that have trust and multilingual ability to communicate with immigrant business owners. So those are a couple of examples around the entrepreneurship angle. Another finding of ours focused on what we're sort of calling microclimates for immigrant integration. And that was really a finding that reflects the fact that people's experience of welcome did not seem to be fully driven by what neighborhood they happened to live in or how old they were when they came here, but was more affected by things like their gender and their region of origin. So we really did see significant differences. 92% of the European respondents in our survey reported feeling welcome when they first arrived in the region, but only 76% of Latin American and Caribbean immigrants reported feeling welcome when they first arrived in the region. So another way to say that is 1 in 4 Latin American and Caribbean residents did not feel welcome when they first came to the Philadelphia region. So that was something that we dug a bit deeper into in some of our follow-up interviews. And really there's a range of tactics that communities can use to try to mitigate some of this differential experiences that immigrants may have. We've put a couple on the slides here. Proactively inviting a diverse range of perspectives when decision-making is happening, whether that's at the block captain level or at the city council level or otherwise. And then using a Citizens Academy model, which is something that's very common in law enforcement and could be used more broadly. Basically, it's typically a group of 12 to 20 community members who meet once a week or once a month for a set period of time, a month, 6 months, to be introduced one at a time to different city agencies and their functions and how they work, so that it doesn't become a confusing or overwhelming surprise if you get a notice of a zoning hearing and you're thinking, well, I just rented this business and I started to open my coffee shop here because somebody else used to have a coffee shop here, and now you're telling me I have to come to a zoning hearing and ask permission to operate this shop that somebody else was running before I even got here. So the Citizens Academy model can help to sort of demystify some American cultural practices for newcomers. Here in Philadelphia, our Commission on Human Relations, which was started almost a half a century ago in part to work on fair housing issues, has really morphed into a much more proactive group that works to diffuse community tensions and help build cross-cultural understanding. And you'll see on the slide here a couple of other activities through City Council, through our organization, that have been done to build cross-cultural understanding. And then finally, I want to talk about the role of infrastructure. And I mean infrastructure in both the literal and the figurative sense. A number of respondents talked about the value of public transit and the ability to get around in the city and the region. Others talked about the value of libraries and other resources for their children. And then the sort of invisible infrastructure, colleges and universities in the area, good public policies that really provide the scaffolding that other initiatives need in order to flourish. So I've put on this slide here a few logos from some of our local refugee resettlement agencies, which have been absolutely integral to a lot of the work of community integration and sort of establishing that nonprofit infrastructure. The School District of Philadelphia, although it is in perpetual and fairly severe budget crisis, has also managed through some very smart hiring to really build tremendous value for immigrant families, both at the point of enrollment, when they're trying to enroll their kids in school and they need perhaps multilingual support, help with immunization forms and things like that, but also throughout a student's career with the district, and ensuring that information that's being provided to parents is available in the 8 major languages spoken in the district and can be translated into others as necessary. I talked a little bit before about colleges and universities, and we certainly heard in our survey about the value of the sort of critical mass that colleges help to establish in a community, whether that's a critical mass of students, of fellow workers if you're employed at the college, or just a critical mass of people who are globally engaged and are thinking beyond the immediate community that they're living in. And we certainly heard that emphasized a number of times by our survey respondents. And then lastly, this is not a finding, but I wanted to provide one last piece of sort of big picture context, and that is that while a policy on paper cannot ensure immigrant integration, it certainly is helpful to have top-down leadership with regard to immigrant talent attraction and retention strategies. And you see here on this slide Mayor Michael Nutter, who's overseen a series of 4 executive orders issued over the past 6 years, as well as the implementation of a Philadelphia Police Department directive on language access. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, these kinds of policy initiatives can also play a significant role in terms of making a region more or less welcoming, and help foster some of that word of mouth or some of that likelihood of staying in the region or recommending the region that we talked about earlier. So I call this slide sort of affectionately my no-brainer slide. And before we go to the Q&A, this slide shows you that if people felt most welcome when they came to the Philadelphia region, they say now that they will be likely to stay here over the long term, which in our survey is the next 5 to 10 years. So you can see that 53% of the people who say they're definitely not going to stay in the region, only 53% of them felt welcome when they first got here. Whereas of the people who say they definitely will stay in the region, almost 90% said they felt welcome when they first came to Philadelphia. So I just like to include this slide because I think it does emphasize that there are so many factors that go into whether somebody feels welcome or not, but really that big picture, that sort of gestalt of, well, did I feel welcome? It really does correlate with whether the person plans to stay over the longer term. So we're going to move now to the question and answer period. Feel free to type questions into the lower right-hand corner into the Q&A box, or to email bao@welcomingcenter.org, bao@welcomingcenter.org, if you have any questions. And following the Q&A period, we're going to talk briefly about what factors to consider if you're considering doing a survey like this in your own community. So I open it up for your questions. I do want to add also that our full report is available on the web at welcomingcenter.org/choosephl. Again, welcomingcenter.org/choosephl. That's our airport code, PHL. And I encourage you to look at that and to contact us if you have follow-up questions about any of the findings or the recommendations in the report. And I look forward to talking with many of you who I know have already implemented some of these strategies in your own communities about the findings that you're having in terms of the strategies that you've implemented. Okay, so we're having a question now from Jennifer Chang, who asks, are there any charts or maps on ethnic locations in Philadelphia? The short answer is yes. The City Planning Commission has created a series of those charts, and they are available at phila.gov/IMA, which stands for Immigrant and Multicultural Affairs. So again, phila.gov/IMA, and click on infographics. So hopefully that will help you find what you're looking for, but don't hesitate to reach out by email following the webinar if you have other questions. So we have another question coming in to ask whether any of our respondents mentioned the pro-immigrant policies that were in place in the city. In general, no. In general, our respondents were talking about their daily experiences, and while those daily experiences might be influenced by the city's policies, we often did not hear about them from respondents. So, for example, respondents might tell us a story about enrolling their children in school, and we did hear that respondents' experiences of the school district were much more negative 10 years ago for those who had arrived longer than 10 years ago than for those who had arrived within the last 10 years. You could hypothesize that the reason for that was because the district has taken a number of steps to establish a more welcoming atmosphere in the past 10 years, but we did not have respondents specifically mentioning the city's policies. By the same token, you could hypothesize that some of the concerns and challenges that people raised around racial profiling and not feeling welcome with the police might be a reflection of the fact that advocates are still working very hard with the department to help with the implementation. Again, good policies on paper don't always translate into well-implemented policies on the ground. So you could hypothesize that perhaps part of the reasoning behind the continuing negative feedback about police experiences is a reflection of the fact that those policies haven't been fully implemented. Okay, we have another question coming in right now. Let's see. Can you shed some light about whether newcomers feel welcome among other newcomer groups, and what efforts are being undertaken to ensure that different groups find the means or fora to interact with other newcomers? So the short answer on that question is that it's all over the map. So we had some respondents who specifically said, we had a Nicaraguan respondent who specifically said, the Puerto Rican community made me feel so welcome. We had a respondent from the Gambia who was very negative about his experience of intertribal or interreligious tension and conflict within African American and African immigrant communities. So we had numerous responses and comments on this question, but there was not a clear consensus about people's either positive or negative experiences interacting with other newcomer groups. It was kind of interesting to us and not entirely predictable that many immigrant newcomers adopt the same kind of sort of neighborhood parochialism that some Philadelphians have. That is, immigrants might not necessarily think of themselves as having a lot in common with other immigrants in general, but other immigrants in South Philly or other immigrants in Kensington or other immigrants in a specific neighborhood within the city or a specific town outside the city often were seen as having more in common. There really is not a consensus among our respondents. Some had a much more sort of big picture awareness of immigrant communities, and some were really sort of focused on their day-to-day, making their individual decisions, and not so much thinking about the fact that they were part of a broader social phenomenon of newcomers. So in terms of the question about, what are the forums that are available for people to interact with other newcomers, well, a couple of things. I mentioned earlier the school district. They often do parent discussion nights or parent, they call it Parent University. So it's programs for parents. Some of those are hosted by the Office of Multilingual Support, so it's specifically targeted at immigrant parents. Others are just focused on the specific school or neighborhood where they're trying to work. The Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations often hosts gatherings, sometimes in response to existing tension, but sometimes more proactively as a way to build shared understanding. And interestingly enough, we did see some very interesting work 2 years ago around Pennsylvania's voter ID law. There was a nonpartisan voter ID education coalition that sort of sprang up after the law passed in Pennsylvania to educate voters, and particularly naturalized citizens and other voters of color or voters who are minorities in some way, about the effect of the law and how to comply with the law. And the Welcoming Center was a kind of a bridge between immigrant service and ethnic organizations and the broader group of good government organizations that were sort of focused on this voter ID effort. And so that was a sort of organic and not predicted forum, but it was an interesting opportunity to have immigration issues heard in the context of a broader issue of community concern. So let's see. Other questions coming in. Can you clarify if a newcomer's language proficiency leads them to feel more comfortable than others who may have language challenges? Did you look into that in the study? So we did not ask about people's comfort with English, either now or in the past. And we did conduct the study in only English and Spanish. We had actually been prepared to be doing research in French and Arabic and another language as well, but there was unfortunately a glitch with our implementation, and the person who was responsible for being able to conduct some of those follow-up interviews ended up not being available to do it. So the short answer is we were primarily talking to people in English and in Spanish, and so people who talked to us already felt some degree of comfort in the English language. Some people volunteered information about the rockiness of their first arrival. I didn't understand. People made fun of my accent. People made fun of my inability to speak English. Others were very pragmatic and very practical. You know, if you listen, it's, you know, you can learn a lot on the job, or you can learn a lot in daily life. We didn't hear a lot of emphasis around community-based English classes. We did hear some. I would say about a dozen respondents volunteered a particular college or community-based class that they had found to be helpful. But it was really more around feeling confident in navigating, and English was a part of feeling confident in navigating the city, but certainly not the only part. So we had another question about if we could give an example of the types of questions we asked in our survey and how the survey was distributed. So I can give a brief example, and then I will encourage you to look at the methodology section of our study, which really does go into this in a great level of detail. So the kinds of questions we asked, the entire survey instrument and all of our questions are actually included as an appendix to the study, which is posted online at welcomingcenter.org/choosephil. And you will also get a link to that in the email that you're going to receive this afternoon following today's webinar. But for example, we asked people the question, all things considered, do you think you would or would not recommend Philadelphia to a friend as a place to live? We also asked the question, before you came here, how did you get information about Philadelphia? So those are a couple of examples of the kinds of questions we asked. Our survey distribution was incredibly broad. We had everything from a table in the largest train station in the area, which has 18,000 commuters through every day, with a poster with a QR code so that people could scan the poster and do the survey on their phones. We had postcards that were distributed at community events. We had an email bulletin that was sent out to about 9,000 contacts. We did a lot of pounding the pavement with individual community groups and contacts, so it was an enormously wide distribution to try to get the widest possible net of respondents. And again, that's described in detail in the methodology section of our survey, which is the last 3 pages right before the appendix at the end of our survey. Okay, we're going to take one last question here because we're right up at 3 o'clock, and that's really around types of work. Questions around were the jobs that people found full-time and permanent? Is it ongoing work? Are there special needs for working with employers? Who coordinates the job placement? So the short answer on this question is that the city tackles it on a couple of levels. Immigrants who are eligible for public benefits are eligible for welfare to work programs. So there's a range of different programs for people who are moving off of welfare and onto work. Most of those jobs are more tenuous jobs, meaning they are more likely to be part-time, they are more likely to be low wage, they are more likely to be, even if they are ostensibly permanent jobs, they're more likely to be a job that a person keeps for 9 months or a year, but not multiple years. However, the majority of immigrants are not eligible for public benefits. And so the other services that we were talking about today were local workforce investment boards contracting with our agency to do employment placement using funds from the Workforce Investment Act, otherwise known as WIA, W-I-A. And this is not unique to Philadelphia. St. Louis, for example, is a city that has also done this. And under the WIA funding requirements, the placement must be in a full-time permanent job and must be of a wage level of at least $12 per hour in our region. Each region has its own wage level requirements. And indeed, we have spent the better part of the last 11 years here at the Welcoming Center developing specialized expertise in working with employers around placing immigrants, and particularly around the divergence between immigrants who have limited English proficiency or limited formal education versus those who have a professional background from their home country. If you're not already familiar with it, I would encourage you to look at imprintproject.org, which has a series of webinars archived on their website. One of them focuses specifically on the topic of employer engagement for working with employers to place immigrant clients. Again, that's imprintproject.org, and on the webinars tab, there's a whole 60-minute webinar and accompanying publication around employer engagement. Okay, we are at time here, so I want to conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us and for your questions. We encourage you to stay in touch and let us know if you do implement a similar survey in your own communities. And we'll be sharing again these survey slides with you, or rather the slides from today's webinar with you today via email, and then next week a copy of the recording of today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us.